Welcome back. So this week what we're going to do is we're going to wrap up with some analysis of contemporary Central Asia, thinking back about how all the different things that we've talked about in this class work to explain Central Asia today. We're going to start out with the two countries that have had the most political upheaval over the last decade. That would be Kyrgyzstan with its Tulip Revolution in 2005 and Uzbekistan with the events of Andijan in 2005 as well. And then we'll get into Kazakhstan, which is next to Kyrgyzstan, the most quote-unquote liberal of the Central Asian states. None of them are particularly liberal. They're just partially free rather than not free at all. Then we'll talk about Turkmenistan and Tajikistan. And finally, I'll wrap up with a bit, just a couple words about how everything sort of fits together. So I want to start off by discussing Kyrgyzstan's Tulip Revolution. There are actually... sorry. One of the things is missing here. There we go. There are actually a couple things that you need to keep in mind when we talk about Kyrgyzstan's revolution. The first one is that there are many similarities to what happened in other parts of the post-communist world and beyond. We talk about color revolutions in Serbia, where you had several 100,000 people take to the streets and demand the end of their authoritarian leadership. Georgia, a few years later, where 100,000 people took to the streets. Ukraine, where 1 million people took to the streets in 2004. But then also this went on to other countries. Lebanon, you had the Cedar Revolution. Some compared the events in Burma with the Saffron Revolution to these. But there are 7 similarities that go through at least the post-communist cases of color revolutions. So there's the case of Serbia, and then Georgia, and then Ukraine, and then what we saw in Kyrgyzstan. First, all of these occurred in semi-autocratic regimes. They weren't completely authoritarian regimes. They were what we call the semi-free countries, these illiberal democracies, where there happened to be openings. The second is that there was an unpopular incumbent in each one of these regimes, especially because of corruption or the general bad direction of the government that was leaving lots of people hurting. Not necessarily abusing people on a regular basis in terms of beating people up in the streets and throwing them in jail, although they did that on occasion as well, but generally for bad policies, especially economic policies. You also had a united and organized opposition in most of these cases, really in all the cases. We'll talk about the Kyrgyz case in a couple minutes. There are various levels of freedom of movement, but all these oppositionists had some experience. You also have the ability of the opposition to demonstrate that the elections were falsified, because you had various electoral monitors who were there saying the elections were illegitimate, and this helps people galvanize support behind them. There's the ability of the opposition to propagate these false election results through an independent press, something that you wouldn't have in a place like Kazakhstan, in a place like Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, or Turkmenistan. I say Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, sorry. You also have the capability of the opposition to mobilize large numbers. Thanks to these things, they're organized. They are strategic in the way that they organize. The National Democratic Institute has been one of those organizations that's helped to organize and create strategies for these organizations. And finally, you have divisions within the power players. In other words, the incumbents have fractions, such as the security services in particular, who sometimes don't want to shoot on their own people because they come from the people. So going back to Kyrgyzstan's revolution, elites around the region by 2005, really 2004, were nervous about the revolutions in the post-Soviet space, especially most recently in Ukraine and Georgia. And so a year before the February 2005 events, President Akayev in Kyrgyzstan noted that the West was only interested in, quote, the expansion of colored revolutions, which he claimed hurt the natural development of democracy. And remember, by this point, Kyrgyzstan's leadership under Akayev had really moved away from the democratization they had had up until the mid-1990s, and they moved much more towards what we call soft authoritarianism, like Kazakhstan, where you had rigged elections or limited possibilities for the opposition. So what happened in Kyrgyzstan? Well, first, it was typical in many ways. You had fraudulent elections, then you had fairly large-scale protests, and then you had the incumbent resigning. Akayev resigned and he went to Moscow. But there were lots of important differences in Kyrgyzstan. First, the protests were largely local. Where local candidates failed, they complained to the local electoral commissions, and then they sometimes gathered tens or hundreds of people to go out and protest. So it was about local candidates, where local candidates failed, not the national candidate. Second, the protests were very small scale. They weren't broad national protests, at least at first, and arguably till the very end. They were largely close-knit groups with direct interests in a candidate, especially family of the candidate, friends of the candidate, campaigners, business supporters. So patronage networks really are key here. The local politicians who had cultivated ties to their people by providing them material support while they were in office then came out and led these protests. The third aspect here is that the protests were built not as a result of national public anger, but out of broadening webs of patronage and elite level alliances. So elite losers gradually created networks of the disenfranchised. There'd be several candidates, and each brought their own supporters to the local stage, and then regional electoral commissions as well. So several candidates coming together, each with their own supporters. So you have a few dozen supporters on the part of each candidate, and you start to have a movement of people. They actually took over regional administration headquarters in the south, and they occupied it for about 2 weeks. So very much localized. The fourth aspect here is that in Kyrgyzstan, the revolution was largely determined by, or a function of, economic inequalities, the south versus the north, rather than broad political demands for freedom per se. And finally, the fifth point here is that Akayev did try to use force, and this only inflamed people and brought more people out to join the demonstrations. So a picture here, as I sort of go through this with the balloons going up into the sky, people celebrating. This whole Kyrgyz tulip revolution started in the south. There were several candidates, each with several hundred supporters, who complained to the local commission that the election results had been falsified. The local electoral commissions blew them off, and so they went on to the regional level, and then they demanded to talk to the governor. Now, as they did this, as they moved to the regional level, they picked up more and more local candidates and their supporters, their respective supporters, along the way. At the top here, you had the People's Movement of Kyrgyzstan, which was a collection of 9 small parties that was based in Bishkek. And they were really divorced from this whole process going on in the south. That's what I mean by the top. They were up north. But they saw this, and then they began to help individual candidates coordinate their own supporters. Where these individual candidates found that their demands weren't met, they ultimately took over the regional administration in Jalalabad. Akayev, the president still at the time, authorized the storming of the Jalalabad regional administration. And this made it look like a north versus south fight. You had injuries, you had people text messaging each other. When we talk about the role of Twitter in these revolutions, I don't think they were actually twittering they weren't actually tweeting, sorry. I don't use that Twitter thing. They weren't actually tweeting, as some of you might say, in these revolutions, in this one. But they did certainly tweet in Egypt in 2011, and afterwards in others, and in Iran in 2007, 2009 as well. But here people were using technology. They were sending text messages to each other. And this brought thousands of people out to the streets. They burned the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which is responsible for the police. They retook the administration. They took over the airport. It was a regional coup. They created a new regional government in the south.